the far right is normalized. Not just that political parties that are far right are seen as normal political parties, just like the Social Democrats or others, but that our ideas, some of the core ideas, for example, that immigration threatens national identity and security, are seen as common sense. Yeah, so the traditional far-right leader, we think about this kind of macho man, brutal, someone like Jean-Marie Le Pen, right? I mean, a war veteran who was sexist and openly racist, things like that. Or even Donald Trump fits that, Bolsonaro. But actually a lot of our leaders of the far right are not even men, like Giorgia Meloni or Marine Le Pen, or they are men that are not classically masculine, like Tom van Grieken of the Vlaams Belang or Jimmy Åkesson of the Sweden Democrats, who kind of look like eternal students types. The type of nativism that we have today is in many cases very much focused on Islam, which has created an opportunity for non-Muslim, non-whites to be kind of accepted, particularly if they're outspokenly Islamophobic. Because that way, the radical right party can say, oh, but we're not racist. Look, we have an African here. Now, a lot of these parties get 20%, sometimes even 30%. The white working class is not enough for that. And so you see more and more that the electorate is pretty broad in terms of class. It's still disproportionately white, almost exclusively white. It is more male than female, but that gap has also closed a bit. And the only group that usually is underrepresented are the university educated. When you think about the extreme right, like you think about Franco or Falange or like Cidade after that, like people who didn't believe in democracy, who believed that a leader should lead. The radical right is more like Vox, people who believe that the people should elect their own leaders, right? That you would have democratic rule. However, they have a very monist interpretation of the people. They believe that the nation has one type of interest and values, that the people have one type of interest and values, and therefore they don't accept minority rights. They don't accept rule of law, separation of powers, which are like building blocks of liberal democracy. But there are countries where the far right is not white, in the BJP in India, for example. But I don't think there is an anti-white far right, but it could be. I mean, it could happen in a country like South Africa or Zimbabwe. What we know from decades and decades of research is that one thing always stands out, and that voters of the radical right not only have strongly negative attitudes towards immigration and immigrants, but that also this issue is very important for them. And so the first and foremost reason why people vote for the far right is cultural backlash. They oppose immigration, they oppose how multicultural society. At the same time, a lot of them don't necessarily have the feeling that they personally are doing worse economically, but they feel that the country is doing worse economically. And so your average radical right voter is not poor. Most poor people, and particularly unemployed people, don't vote. Yeah, I think there's a difference between not talking about them and not talking with them. And so from a media point of view, my point is it important to give them a platform? Like the argument is, well, we have to give them a platform because people need to know what they think. But a journalist can tell us that. Like a journalist can study the Vox and analyze them and lay out what they stand for, and also lay out why, like how that relates to liberal democracy and why that is a problem. Alternatively, you do an interview or you give them even a column. Then you give them a platform. You give them a platform to tell like lies or twist truth, and you legitimize them as an actor. They will now be one of the parties. And I think that for me, the media or academia are institutions that flourish within liberal democracy and only liberal democracy. And as a consequence, we should take a position. Anything that weakens liberal democracy is threatening to us. That means that you treat those types of actors differently. And so I'm personally opposed to sharing a platform with the far right. I'm also opposed to ignoring them because they're part of society. And if you want to protect liberal democracy, you have to understand what the threats are. Vox is a very new phenomenon. As soon as it had one regional success by and large, PP was open to talk to them. In most other countries, this took decades. Now, of course, this is in part because Spain was late, right? But it's still remarkable because Vox is not necessarily more moderate than other radical right parties. Of course, it does come out of PP. And we call that a reputational shield. Radical right parties that come out of the mainstream tend to get away with more because they're seen as conservatives still at heart, who just provoke a bit, who sound more extreme than they really are. Whereas the radical right, the traditional one, is always seen as sounding less radical than they really are, that they're actually kind of closet Nazis. I personally think that in much of Europe, most of the damage has been done by mainstream parties, and particularly mainstream right-wing parties who have adopted nativism opportunistically to fight off the challenge of the radical right. You clearly see that with PP. It predates Vox, but it's now even stronger. And so I think at the moment, the danger is that PP moves to the right in the hope to weaken Vox and get a majority by itself, and then rules with for opportunistic reasons, relatively nativist and authoritarian policies. At the same time, ultimately, Vox is more of a challenge because Vox is not nativist or authoritarian for opportunistic reasons. But the chance that Vox will get a majority is pretty small compared to PP getting a majority. When Vox rules, yeah, I do think so. First of all, because they're competent, which you shouldn't underestimate. I've lived 4 years under an incompetent far-right president, and we were lucky with that. I know Hungary very well. You see what happens when a far-right competent leader has power, and he dismantles liberal democracy, maybe the democracy as such. You see at the moment Meloni, who targeted through several, which seems very detailed laws, is nevertheless like weakening the independence of judiciary, intimidating journalists, things like that, weakening minority rules. And so yes, I think it changes. Does it change for most white people? Like less, as long as you're not outspoken against them. Will it change for women? Will it change for LGBTQ? Will it change for migrants? Massively. And increasingly, we live in completely different worlds. It's not just that we see the same world, but we have different preferences. No, the far right increasingly sees the world as different. They see conspiracies, they see exaggerated numbers of foreigners, they see exaggerated corruption, and they get this from sources that we might think are illegitimate or conspiracy theories. For them, those are as relevant or credible as the New York Times or the Washington Post. And so I personally think, do your thing, like talk to them. But I think that there is a problem because they also often drag you into it and say, yeah, but like, don't you also think that? And so if you don't agree with them give them something, like they're not opening up to you. But at the end, you might give them all kind of things and they still don't give you anything. To be honest, I've never thought about the fifth wave. Like, I mean, when I wrote the fourth wave, I never thought about it, and one of the first questions I got about my book is, when is the fifth wave? And I was like, can we first deal with the fourth wave? I don't know what the fifth wave is. It doesn't have to be that the far right is dominant or hegemonic. It can be that the far right is back into a kind of an accepted semi-marginalized phenomenon. But to be honest, I think the far right is here to stay as a mainstreamed actor. And that goes up and down. I mean, if they do something particularly extreme, they will be put like outside of what is acceptable for a while, and then there will be a new leader and says, oh, like that was very bad, and we come back. But I mean, politics would have to move significantly back to the left or to what used to be the center for the radical right to really stand out from the rest. So I expect the fourth wave to be with us for a while.